Hello, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ted Stewart. Today's webinar is going to be on using motor controllers in a SIF. Before we get started, if you wouldn't, please go ahead and notice the questions toolbar. If you have any questions, feel free to throw some questions at me during the presentation. If I'm able to answer them while I'm in the middle of it, I definitely will. If not, questions will be answered at the end. Let's go ahead and get started. Thanks so much, everybody. My name is Ted Stewart. I am the Program Development and Compliance Manager for exida. I have over 10 years of experience in safety and high availability automation systems, manufacturing, lean process improvement. My responsibilities here is I help manage the OEM certification division. I'm the Deputy Quality Manager and also the Director of the CFSP program. So it's a lot of fun. I get to wear a lot of different hats. I walk in every day not knowing what my day is going to entail. So I love it. It keeps me on my feet. Our company was founded in 1999 by some of the world's top reliability and safety experts. You can see here, we have a lot of little red dots all over the world. Every year, we feel like we have a new one. The most recent office we just opened up, I believe it's official, is we have now an office in India, which is very, very exciting. And who we are is we basically help in functional safety, alarm management, and of course, cybersecurity. Now, exida, we're involved with the complete supply chain of functional safety in many different industry sectors. It's unique from the sense that we can help the original equipment of the manufacturers who require these certifications. And then we also get to help the end users that are using those products. So it's great to see both sides. Now, we do provide software tools, trainings, consulting, and procedures that are related to all the different areas that we help with. You know, we have functional safety, which we're branching out to, you know, different untapped areas like robotics, right? We're doing more and more in machine safety. We're doing, I think the fastest growing area right now is our cybersecurity division. And of course, we also have alarm management. Now, when you see this slide, and I always say, you know, think for a moment, how can exida help you? Where are you spending a lot of your time, your effort, your money? Do you need help at your site? Do you spend time working on equations, building your own SIFs? Like today, we're going to be talking about some safety instrumented functions. But I always say, you know, whether it's machinery, robotics, cybersecurity, alarm management, anything to do with functional safety, I challenge everyone to let's ask some questions. Let's use this time. Let's have some great conversations. And so I do feel free to ask any kind of questions you would like. Now, why do I like these types of changes? Or these questions is, you know, we're working with a company right now, very happy to be working with exida. They are hiring the top safety experts around the world. And when this slide came out, when this chart came out, I was actually kind of surprised to see how much impact we've made around the world. And many other certifying bodies, what we're finding out is just so engulfed in taking up other industries, not just in functional safety. And I believe that's one reason why we're starting to pull away, where, you know, we're trying to become that agency that kind of breaks the mold, where we focus strictly on customer service and we help remove those pains and hurdles that people face when implementing functional safety, alarm management, and cybersecurity. Okay, I got through my initial slides. Thank you, everybody. We always have some new people on this call, so we'd like to quickly go through those. Let's get into today's topic. Today on today's webinar, will be focused around the increasing demand for safety with those motor controllers. We'll talk about the barriers that end users will face when performing these SIF designs. We'll talk about how to fill the void when failure rate information is non-existent, it's lacking, maybe you have bits and pieces, so we'll help you figure out around that. And then finally, we'll review an example in Excellentia 4 of a motor controller when you use it in a SIF that's attempting to achieve SIL certification, or just SIL rating. Now, when you first start talking about motor controllers, it's always a gray area. You'll soon realize that the classification of this motor controller is not black and white. And in this webinar, I'll quickly go through my explanation and how I see everything fitting together. And you'll see here in front of you right away, when you do even a search for what a motor controller is, you get different definitions. You know, the first one there, it's a good definition, but it's kind of brief. I believe it's kind of incomplete, where it basically just talks about that it performs control logic and it's going to turn a motor on and off. I personally think a motor controller definition should be a little more robust. And I like the second one more, where it does talk about how it can be done manually, it can be done automatic, it could be good for stopping and starting, or even the rotation of the motor controller. Does it go forward? Does it go in reverse? Do you limit the torque? And then also, does it protect against overloads and faults? So I think that's a better definition. So you can see that motor controllers can be a plethora of things. It can be as simple as it can go all the way down to just a device with a relay and a contactor. It can be a smart item like a drive. It could be a starter. And this is kind of how I started the classifications, where I said, look, there are motor controllers, and these are just two branches. There's drives and there's starters. But I feel as though relays and contactors fit within those drives and starters and aren't directly considered a motor controller, in my opinion, right? And so let me tell you about how I, where I see these descriptions. So, for example, if you have a relay, it's going to either operate as electromagnetic or as solid state. Relays are type A. An example of that is as you can see here, we have a picture of an E300 by Rockwell. It's one of the few certified devices out there. It's an overload relay. And what an overload relay does is it offers that reliable and precise protection for motors in an event of that overload or phase failure. The electric overload relay can make up a compact starting solution together, and if you have contacts with it. Now, if you talk about the contactors, this is also a type A device, which means it really doesn't have any microprocessors. It's a simple device. It really can't think for itself. So in comparison to a relay, a contactor is designed to handle more current. It can be either a single pole or a 3-pole device. And a contactor has a coil that will energize and pull in the assembly, and that's what makes the contact to that control signal. And that's what, hence the name, it's a contact, right? It makes that contact. And so a contactor is a relay, a contactor or a relay, I should say, can be part of that motor controller. And the variance here depends on the size of the load to that switch. Now let's get into some smarter devices. Motor starters. A motor starter has more functionality than a contactor and can be either a smart device or a not so smart device, a type A or a type B. Now these products, basically what these products do is they limit that inrush current and the mechanical torque at that startup operation. And because these control functions, it helps prolong that mechanical life of that motor and then reduces any voltage dips. The fun thing that we're seeing is that last year in 2017, we started seeing that shift in the industry, and we're now receiving all these inquiries from manufacturers to certify these types of products due to that increasing demand from the end users that are actually using these in safety systems. And that hence this webinar today, from the questions we receive, we are now saying, hey, look, we have to start catching up. We need to start getting some failure information for these types of devices because people want them. And it's becoming more and more apparent. And from this morning webinar, it was even reconfirmed by the questions that were asked on how do they obtain more of this generic information if nothing does exist. And we'll talk about that towards the end of today's presentation. Let's go into motor drives. Now, these help control voltage and current to a motor to stop it, to start it, to control the speed of the motor. And the most common, most modern way of doing so is with a variable frequency drive. All right, these utilizes that solid state electronics. Now, these drives, these frequency drives, they indeed seem to be that primary way of controlling this variable speed. They use a rectifier to turn this AC power into a smooth DC current, and then it gets turned back into AC current as a determined frequency using like an inverter. Now, if we move into the safe torque off, this one is a function that keeps that motor from restarting once it's stopped, right? So that's one of the safety functions is boom, it stops it and it will not allow it to get back started on its own. And that's one of the many functions that can be built into these motor drives. So now we've quickly talked about how I classify motor controllers gave some brief information in the background. Now let's go into the barriers. So what are the barriers that these end users or these engineerings face when they perform a SIF design? When the end user is choosing a device to incorporate into their SIF, there are three major barriers that must be, let's just say, hurdled to say that that SIF is in compliance with IEC 61511 to achieve that SIL rating. The SIL level of a product is determined by those three things. It's the systematic capability rating, the architecture constraints for the element or device, and then the PFDavg calculation for the product. And you can have PFH, but today's conversation, I'm going to just speak on a low demand sense because that's where the majority of information is lacking. You will have a lot of information on high demand, but low demand is really where the industry is seeing a void in the market. Now, each of these requirements is a barrier, and they all have to be considered, and that end user has to get by all of these to achieve that SIL rating for a SIF. You can't just do one, you must do all three. Systematic capability is the first one. It's established by having your quality management system audited per 61508. If the QMS meets the requirements of 61508, a SIL capability rating is issued. The rating achieved, whether it's SIL 1, SIL 2, or SIL 3, depends on the effectiveness of that quality management system. So the more work you put into that quality management system, the more requirements you meet, that's one way to get a higher systematic capability. What are some questions that you may be asked when you're working on this area? It could be, well, how do you source your part suppliers? How do you make modifications? How are returns and recalls handled? Now, the certificate itself is for the systematic capability of the product. And when you look at a certificate, and when a motor controller becomes certified, this systematic capability is already known and shown on a certificate. And without this product certificate, this barrier becomes a lot harder for that end user. They're going to have to go through probably a proven and use justification if they don't have something showing this process. It's going to cost them a lot of time and a lot of money, and the manufacturer will have to that manufacturer that does provide that third-party certificate or a certificate to the end user. It's a huge time saver for the end user. Now, the architecture constraints is that second barrier, and you can establish this in different ways. You can go route 1H, you can go route 2H, you can do both. And in the evaluation of your motor controller, your device will be evaluated based on these constraints. It can be done by the complexity of the device or by the field operating history. And that's where you get to the 1H and the 2H. Now, there are different SIL tables in 61508 and 61511 to determine that architecture constraints depending on which SIL rating that end user needs when they're developing that SIF. So they'll say, hey, I need a SIL 2 application. And then that's when you can go to your chart and see what do you need as far as your architecture constraints. Once again, when a manufacturer does have this product certified, the certificate will actually tell the end users and let them know how to calculate their architecture constraints using those tables of 61511. And if you see on this one, the hardware fault tolerance or redundancy is actually stated. Now, this does inform that end user that if multiple devices are needed, they now know when they're developing their SIF. The third barrier. The PFD calculation is an equation given in the standards that uses 9 different variables to achieve that probability of failure on demand. All right, it's based on the dangerous failure rate. It's based on system diagnostics, proof test coverage and test intervals, maintenance and other conditions that are controlled by both the manufacturer's product and how the end user is going to use that device or that element. And from the product certificate, the end user can now take the failure rates, right, that are going to be on this back, and I'll show a picture of that. And they can, with that knowledge, they can now start putting together and testing the SIF and calculate that PFDavg from the failure rates that are given. And one thing I do like to note is that it's important not to have a manufacturer give you a PFD average, right? There are too many variables from the equation that a manufacturer would have to assume to provide that type of value or to provide that type of number. And it would become very misleading and very dangerous if a PFD average was given to an end user when the end user is still trying to design or wants to set up their own requirements. Now, one other thing to note, though, one positive thing here is that for like a type A device like a motor contactor or any other final element assembly, with the PFD average, and let's say it only hits SIL 1, there are things that you can do for your PFD average to improve it to a SIL 2, like your proof testing and your diagnostics. So, and that's something actually in my example, I'll show you how that does come into play. Now, here's the back page showing about the PFD, well, not the PFD average, but showing the numbers to get to that PFD number, right? So you can you can go here. Most certifying bodies, they do publish the failure rate numbers based on these predictions. And if you are the end user, you can now take these numbers and calculate your PFD number with the other variables. And of course, if you're unable to, maybe you don't know how to use these failure rate numbers, send us an email. We'll get you over some great information and help you out wherever we can. But this is something that we think is important. We're seeing some people trying to take shortcuts, and really, it's not that hard, and there's no need to do that. So far, we're getting through all the different barriers. We're getting down to the PFD average, and all of a sudden, we're throwing failure rates at people, which is a good thing. And now this is something to where this is what people want. But we want them for motor controllers. And so, where do these failure rate numbers come from? So let's talk quickly about what an FMEDA is. And so if I can shed some light on this subject, let's quickly start at the basics. And if you remember back in school, you go back to that topic on reliability, it basically said that failure rate of a series system is the sum of the failure rates of the components, right? So if you add up all the components, you get a top level number. And this is essentially the concept of an FMEDA. An FMEDA, it does stand for a failure mode effect diagnostic analysis. And this approach has been globally accepted, and it can even be applied to a newly designed device. And a study was done on this device, and it looks at the strength of that device. It looks at the failure rates of each component and how the component failures will affect the device. And this failure mode effect diagnostic analysis, this FMEDA, it's a technique that was developed by the engineers here at exida, and it's used to evaluate that reliability of that given product. And the results of this FMEDA analysis are those set of failure rates that can be used to determine that product and overall SIF probability of failure, right? So now during the FMEDA, this study is done on the design strength of the device by looking at the failure rates. So the thing is, this is the approach to help to create those predictable failure rates. But how do we use something like this for, let's just say, a newly designed motor controller or some product that might not even be developed? How are we able to predict these numbers? Well, many companies have learned this approach, and I'll get to that answer here. And a lot of companies have started creating their own FMEDAs. While it is the most effective approach, right, for a predictable failure rate, the FMEDA is only as good as the database used to create that FMEDA. Now, we have seen many instances where someone performed an FMEDA using failure information from industries other than the process industry. Or they use data for, let's just say, a high demand system, like B10 data, when the FMEDA that they're creating is actually for a low demand system. This is extremely dangerous, very misleading. So when you do receive failure information, all you really need to do is just ask those questions. Like, for example, ask where the database, the information came from when they created this FMEDA. We even here have a sheet of 5 or 6 different questions that you can ask those manufacturers that give you this these numbers, so that you can make sure that the numbers that they generated are going to be useful to you. Because if you don't have great information, you're not going to get great results. And so the information is only as good as the database that is used. And that is one reason why we're growing this database for motor controllers, is because the more information we can gather from the industry, the better and more predictable these failure rates will become, so that we can start accurately producing these failure rates. Now, if you notice this diagram in front of you, we used to never specify that we do a calibrated FMEDA, but the reason why we do it is because our FMEDAs are constantly compared to that actual field failure data in the industry. And now we can start comparing realistic failure rates over and over and over again with all our predicted results. And as we see fit, if our predicted results aren't matching with the realistic ones, we start calibrating and redefining these failure rates. Because if, say, the industry for, I don't know, a valve or something, and there's some components in this valve, and now all the manufacturers are realizing, hey, I should be using these components. And they start changing how they're producing these parts, and the parts aren't failing as much. Now, as we see these improvements, that failure rate becomes better, right? And so we do adjust our failure rates based off what we see in the industry, and that's what gives us our very useful numbers. Now, like all equipment used in a SIF, a motor controller must also be justified based on the integrity, the safety integrity. And fortunately, the industry is starting to evolve to a point where, we're now starting to see companies coming to us, and we're working with a few different motor controller manufacturers currently, all trying to get their product certified to 61508 because of that need. Now, these safety certified devices, they're in their own special class of products. They have very advanced automatic diagnostics that can detect many of the internal failures. And if you want to see them, you can go to the SIEL website of those products that are certified. I think the most recent one was the Rockwell E300. That was an overload relay. They just finished just last month. So, okay, that's great. It's great that we're starting to get failure rate information more specific for different products. But what happens when information is lacking and there isn't failure rates associated to that device you'd like to use in that safety system? Well, the first thing I tell people is, well, go ask that manufacturer, get that information. If they don't have it, ask them to find a way to develop this failure rate information. Because it's something that we're going to need to use more and more instead of just using generic rates. But if you're unable to get these failure rate information and you need to move on a project, yes, there are ways, and yes, you are allowed to continue and move forward developing the SIF even without specific numbers. And this is something that I can show you. Now, because you now, hopefully, I hope, created this better picture of what is needed in this industry. And now when people are going to start developing these SIFs with motor controllers, which many have already done, and we've seen actually more people just kind of ignore the motor controller or find a way to get it outside the SIF so they don't have to deal with it. But that's definitely not the right way of going things, but that's just what they had at the time. And yeah, a product does not need to be certified, so don't worry about that. However, you have to find a way to get these failure rate information. And if it is not going to be a certified product, then someone needs to go through and justify all those other hurdles, right? They have to go through their systematic capability. They'll have to develop their own justification for architecture constraint. And then they're going to have justification for the failure rates. And the one thing I always ask people is, look, if this is something that you're interested in and you're going to start developing these SIFs and they're not certified equipment, just make sure the person that's developing these SIFs is trained, will become an expert in this area of functional safety. Because I always tell people, my easiest example is when I buy a home, I don't pretend like I'm a plumber or an electrician. If I want to be safe, I either need to get trained and go to school to do those tasks, or I just need to hire an expert and make sure they do it correctly for me. All right, so failure rates don't exist. Here we go. They don't exist for your product. You must use it on the safety system. You ask your manufacturer, they're not going to help produce failure rate numbers for you. There is a backup plan. It's not the best way, but it will keep you safe if no data exists. Now, as this industry grows, the good news is so does this website, SILSAFE Data. It's a great place for generic information to help assist you when there's no data present. Normally, when SILSAFE Data is brought up and analyzed, many ask, well, how did the upper and lower bounds get generated, right? So let's talk about that. exida, we do have this database. It's grown every day. It's been growing for decades now, well over 200 billion unit operating hours of that actual field failure data. So what happens is this data is then compiled into our component database, and then it's used to create that calibrated FMEDA. We use our large database and compare our findings to our industry database, and from those comparisons, right, with all these different FMEDAs, going through ARITA data and all these other databases that are out there, this is how we create our upper and our lower bound. The tool is extremely useful, and anyone who, why I say it's extremely useful, because anyone who wants to actually check the validity of our failure rate of a product, right, they just get this sheet and has all these failure rates, you don't know what to do. But even a person that doesn't know anything about functional safety, they now have a place to go to and just see if that number falls between the limits. If it does, okay, you did a sanity check, you're looking pretty good. If it doesn't, you got a red flag and you need to ask more questions. Because we're seeing a lot of unrealistic failure rates, mainly because there's no data out there. Now here's a snapshot of that SIL-safe data for motor controllers. And you can see there that there's contactors, relays, VFD drives, safe torque off. Interesting thing you can also see is even with a contactor, the different voltages. I mean, if you have something over 600 volts, you have a different range of limits that you must meet. And so really make sure that you pick the correct product, you know how it's going to be used so that you know which lower and upper bound to apply. Now, if you are using generic failure rate, please, 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 we always recommend don't use the lower limit, right? If you're going to just use generic information, you need to start doing something. Maybe you're working an Excellentia and you want to put together a SIF, please use the upper limit as a generic result. Once you ask that manufacturer to get those failure rates and they can get those failure rates for you, then you can start using those numbers. And I almost guarantee you, getting actual field failure rates from the manufacturer, whether they get an FMEDA or however they want to do it, you'll have a much better result if they're able to get this for you. So if you do have a favorite manufacturer, reach out to them, call them, tell them, look, I need an FMEDA, I need failure numbers. I can't use this generic because that isn't the best way to do it. But at least, like I said, it's a sanity check, and it's a very conservative approach. All right, so now let's go into a motor controller example. I made this up yesterday using our new Excellentia 4, which I'm still even learning, but I took some screenshots here of the tool. And so here's what I did. All right, so we started, and this was from a real customer. So I did take out some of the customer's information there. But what happened was in this example, we call it product 1. They have, their sensor, which is the Krone H250. They had a logic solver, which is a GE Mark 6, and they had a final element part. And notice there they used a generic relay and a generic motor starter. All right, they then chose, okay, this is an SSI, a site safety index of 2, which is your normal. That's usually what everyone is, unless you go above and beyond. They set their mission time, they set their startup time. And then you see at the bottom there, the chart, how they did. Well, if you look at it, let's just say they want to achieve a SIL 2. Well, they achieved a SIL 1. If I could, let me see if I can get a pointer here. Spotlight, here we go. Well, if you look here, they achieved a SIL 1, which is great. If we go over here, their PFD average was a SIL 1. If you see here, they had a SIL 1 for their sensor. They had a SIL 3 for the logic solver, a SIL 2 for their final element, and their SIF was overall a SIL 1. So they achieved SIL 1. So the question now becomes, well, how can I get this to a SIL 2? What can I do? Well, the first thing I noticed when I was looking through this example was, well, they first used the product here. Their sensor, it was not a certified product. So I was like, all right, let's just change out the sensor. Let's put a certified product in there and see what happens, right? Hold on a second. I think I have to change the slide here. Awesome. So let's just change the sensor and see what happens. All right, we changed it. I put a Honeywell SMV 800. So now let's come down here. Well, I'm still at SIL 1. All right. However, if you notice from before, can I click? There we go. Now, if you notice from before, now all of a sudden my sensor, I'm using a certified device, it goes to SIL 2, which is great. However, I still only achieve a SIL 1, right? And then my PFDavg now I'm noticing, okay, that's still SIL 1. So what can I do to help improve this? Well, now the next thing that we decided to do, okay, well, if we're all at SIL 1 on my PFDavg, I looked over here in my final element of the PFDavg, the biggest thing is the final element, right? This is contributing to the biggest piece of this, 91.5%. And what is the final element? It's your motor starter, your generic information. All right, so we came over to here and we said, okay, for this, let's change this proof test interval to just 1 year. And doing so, now let's see what we got. There's our Honeywell sensor, proof test interval 1 year. There we go. PFDavg to achieve a SIL 2. Everyone's got a big happy face. So that's an example of how when you're using generic information, you still can achieve what you need to achieve. Here it was a SIL 2 application, and you can still hit your goals using this generic information. So if there's nothing out there, it's good at least to use your generic information while this void is present, and until we have more people certifying their products, you can you can at least get by with that. But please don't avoid the motor starter. Don't avoid these things. Don't try and take them out of your safety integrated functions. Just do what you can with this information. And here's the other thing: if you need that information, like I said, ask those manufacturers, because more than likely they're more than happy to make sure that you have the information you need. All right, let's answer some questions here. Let me see here. I know there's some questions that have been coming through. Sure. So the first question is, are you okay with a 106 for the risk reduction factor? That seems pretty low, barely making a SIL 2. Let's go back here. Yeah, 106. Well, here's the thing. The SRS, right, it must specify a risk reduction factor as a specific value, right? So that needs to be required. Otherwise, if it's not required, the 106 does meet the requirements. So if they're not saying that you need anything greater than that, then you're good. And of course, that's why that risk reduction factor should be included in that SRS. So if there's nothing specified, you achieve your SIL 2, then yes, that is acceptable. Of course, it can go up to 1,000, so there's a huge range in there. However, you don't need to over design something if it's not a requirement. Good question, though. All right, the next thing here. Are there vendors other than Rockwell who manufacture SIL certified MCC relays? Well, off the top of my head, here's what I would say is call your manufacturer, whoever you like to use, whoever that supplier is, and tell them and ask them if it has failure rate information associated to it, and tell them that you want it to have. Tell them that you want it to be certified, and perhaps they'll help you out and they'll actually do that. But if you want to know more as to what is certified, I would just recommend you go to the SAEL website. If you don't know that website, send me a quick link. Let me go back to my email, and I'll go ahead and get you that information so you can take a look at it. Good question. Can you explain why the data in the MTTFS column and the pie chart don't tally? Looking at these charts, they do tally. If you want, you can send me an email and I can get you a detailed explanation as to why they do. But just so that you know, the MTTFS SIF, what that equals, it's basically inverse. So you can do like 1 over, and then if you could think of some parentheses here, it's like 1 over, and then it's 1 over MTTFS sensor plus the 1 over MTTF logic solver plus the 1 over MTTF final element. So those three, right? Those inverses over like 1 over. Basically, if you add them all up, you will get that total SIF, which is that 36.85 that you see down there on the MTTFS. So it is accurate. If you need more information on that, by all means, go ahead and send it. What I am going to do is all these questions, if I get to them all, that'd be awesome. If I don't get to some of your questions, because they're piling in here, I'm going to have all the questions typed up, and I'll send those all out to everybody. So bear with me. And if you want something more one-on-one, just send me an email if I do miss your question here. All right, next one. Can the average start-stop operation of the equipment be used for proof test interval for the final element since the motor control is being exercised? Let's see. So can an average start-stop operation of the equipment be used for proof test interval for the final element since the motor control is being exercised? Well, yeah. Yes, it can. If the success and failure criteria is established, okay, and records are kept, if you're using like SILSTAT for that purpose, you may use that for proof test interval. Yes. I noticed that you're using 1 out of 1 voting. So if you have a control relay de-energizing the contactor, is this considered 1 out of 1? Would have thought it was 2 out of 2. Well, no. Both relays must operate, or the relay and the contactor must operate to achieve that safety. Therefore, you have to have 1 out of 1. In your motor controller example, shouldn't there be an allowance for the motor as part of the final element? Only in energized trip applications, when that motor, when the motor movement is required to achieve that SIL state, is when you need to have that. But this is a de-energized to trip application, so you would not need to have the allowance for the motor. Good question, though. Next question. Are all VFD applications considered high demand, even though condition that causes the trip occurrence at a low demand rate? It sounds like you're thinking of the control function, which is likely to be continuous, okay, because it's going to keep spinning. However, the safety function is normally defined as that input when it goes to 0 and that motor stops. That's what low demand is. So hopefully I answered that question there. Are all devices in the SIL-safe data, are they SIL certified? Good question. Now, SIL-safe data, it's a list of generic device categories with failure rates of lower and upper restriction limits. So the certification is not a subject of that list. That's not something we would care to look at when we consider SIL-safe data. But if you want to see a list of those certified devices, that's when you want to go to SAEL, and that's www.sael-online.com. And you can go and you can actually look at all the certified devices. If an MTBF is only available, how can the percent of, say, failure fraction or the architecture constraints be evaluated? This was actually a question earlier this morning. If you only have the MTBF, there's really no realistic evaluation that can be made on that. So you are going to have to go back to that manufacturer and get some more questions, get some more information. All right, let's see here. Hold on 1 second here. Okay, the motor controller must be considered as a final element or an auxiliary element in the SIF calculation question. And what about the motor too? My best sense for you is it actually depends on the system functionality. If the motor stoppage is not needed to achieve safety, then that motor controller in that then the motor controller in motor and auxiliary, you don't need to consider that. Let's see here. Yeah, really, I mean, I guess it just all depends on the functionality. So you need to know if that motor stoppage is needed or not. How did a generic motor starter have a SIL2 rating? Are there 2 generic motor starters, and does this not meet 61511 requirements? Well, if you look at the new standard, I don't know, maybe I only refer to the 2016 version because that's the latest one out there for 61.511. But the latest standard, it does not require that you have to have any hardware fault tolerances to achieve that SIL 2. So you can achieve SIL 2, and you do not have to have 2 generic motor starters, according to the diagrams. Got a question here. I'm going to have to look up the answer to. It says, is there a maximum voltage or horsepower that will prevent the interlock from being a SIF with no SIL rating? Heard an interlock that trips at 600 plus volt motor cannot have a SIL value. I don't know if that's true. If you don't mind, I'll do some quick research and get with my experts and see if I can't come up with an answer for you, Jimmy. Good question. I don't know that one off the top of my head. Let's see here. So I'm just trying to go through and see which ones I've answered. All right, let's do this one right here. Do you have to replace the contactor when you had an overload of the contactor? Well, that one depends on that manufacturer. I don't think that's something that's a white or black answer. What I would recommend is that most do require the replacement. Okay, so if you do have an overload of a contactor, you do probably want to replace it. However, I would go back to the manufacturer and ask them. All right, I don't know if I answered all of them. I think I did. I might have missed one or two. If I did, I'm so sorry. I will review all of these questions here. I will get back to you as soon as possible. I'll see if I can't get them done tonight for you. I do appreciate everyone's time. Like I said, I'm sorry if I missed one or two here. Great questions. I'll put everything together. If you want, send me an email. I'll make sure I get to you as soon as possible. As far as, I know we had one or two slides here, really. As far as exida Academy, if you're looking for any kind of training, go to our website. Here's a few that are listed here. Whether you want training on silver, excellencia, functional safety, alarm management, automotive, fire and gas. And then, of course, I really recommend this. I know some people don't push this so much, but we always put our latest and greatest information. A lot of our free stuff we'll post on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. If you have those accounts, you may as well follow us. That way you can get everything. And if you have a suggestion for a topic, go ahead and send it to academy@exida.com. Thank you so much, everyone. If I did miss a question, I do apologize. There were a lot of questions today, and I really appreciate that. I'll get them all answered and send you guys a copy of those answers. Thanks again. Really appreciate it. Have a great day, you guys. Take care for now. Bye-bye.